And I think that people obviously just respond to the incentives that policy creates for them here, right? I don't want to say anybody's a bad person for doing these things. Policies created incentives for people to act in a particular way. And if we want them to act differently, then we should change the policy and they'll respond accordingly, right? If we put different incentives in place, financial incentives particularly are strong for people. And if we want them to play by a different set of rules, we just have to create that different set of rules.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is ISER economist Dr. Brett Watson. Born and raised in a suburb of Houston, Texas, Brett made his way to Anchorage in 2017 as a postdoc at the University of Alaska Anchorage after earning his PhD in mineral and energy economics at the Colorado School of Mines. We discuss how he ended up with his current job, and we do a dive into two topics of great interest to many listeners: Alaska's PFD system and Anchorage's housing market. Brett Watson, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew.
Where did you grow up?
So I grew up outside of Houston, Texas, in a town called Tomball. Lived there for most of my life. Went to college at Texas State University in San Marcos, where I studied economics, grad school in Colorado, and then here.
What did you study in grad school?
My PhD is in mineral and energy economics, which I got at the Colorado School of Mines, which is sort of why I ended up here in Alaska thinking about natural resource issues.
When you were a small child, did you see yourself getting a PhD in mineral economics?
No, when I was a small child, I wanted to study dinosaurs or astronomy, I think, like most kids. The way that I came, I think, to thinking about economics as a career is I was interested in my later years in high school in politics, interested in public policy. And when I took my first economics class in college, everything just sort of started to click. I realized that the interesting conversations that were happening in the public policy space were usually around the issues of economics to me, or at least use the language of economics that I was learning in the classroom, and realized that that's the field that I wanted to get into, was to provide information to public policy debates, thinking about it through the lens of economics.
What year did you get your PhD?
I got my PhD in 2017.
And then you moved to Anchorage?
That's right. Yeah. So it was a whirlwind couple of months for me. I finished my dissertation in the spring of 2017, went on the job market, got the job up here. And my husband and I got married on June 10th. And on June 14th, we got in the car to move to Alaska.
And had you both wanted to move to Alaska, or was it something that just happened?
Oh, I've always been very opportunistic. And so I like to play a lot of board games. And when I play board games, I can usually think about one move ahead. And that generally, I think, has applied to my life too, that I can usually think about one move ahead. And so
you don't really have a 5 or a 10-year plan. It's more like this year plan.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. If I can figure out what I'm going to be doing next year, that's usually pretty good for me. So no, Alaska hadn't been on our radar. I had applied to a bunch of different jobs coming out of grad school. I had opportunities kind of around the world. And I thought Alaska sounded like a really fun adventure. I think this is most people's stories that end up staying here, but we thought that we'd be up here for a couple of years and then probably move back somewhere in the lower 48, but ended up falling in love with it.
How did you meet your husband?
Tyler and I met in college. We were both we've actually met at church. We were part of two different campus ministries that met in the same building. And he was president of his Episcopal Lutheran campus ministry, and I was president of the Methodist campus ministry. And we had a bit of a rivalry before we became friends and eventually started dating.
That's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting trajectory.
Yes.
Had you grown up religious?
Yeah. I had been affiliated with churches and fairly involved in churches all my life growing up. My husband and I still attend church weekly and are still fairly active in the church's ministries today. We attend a Methodist church together here in town. And it's always been a really positive aspect of my life.
Was your church always accepting of LGBTQ stuff?
No, it wasn't. I didn't really come out to myself until college. Didn't start coming out to other people until my husband and I started dating. And so kind of reconciling that religious identity with my sexual identity was a big process in college and afterward.
Did Tyler pull you out of the closet? I mean, was he already out? I mean,
no, we came out together.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And has your family been accepting?
I would say for the most part. I think like a lot of folks, they struggled with it at the beginning. But their relationship with Tyler has gotten a lot warmer over the years as they've gotten to know him as a person and as a part of my life. And just understanding better, I think, who I am, kind of in totality. It was, I think, a challenge for them.
How old are you?
32.
32.
Yeah.
I talked about this with your husband. So disclosure for our listeners is that I know the two of you socially. Your husband mentioned that the Methodist churches in Anchorage, even those that aren't explicitly flying a gay pride flag, are open to LGBTQ members. I grew up in a Methodist church in a suburb of Houston, like you, and can say that even today, that Methodist church is not accepting in any way, shape, or form, and would be unlikely to fly a gay pride flag ever. I assume Tom Ball is similar.
Yeah, and I believe that my church has voted to disaffiliate itself from the Methodist Church,
because they don't want to embrace
right.
LGBTQ issues.
That's right. Yeah.
Do you have a relationship with folks that you were friends with, that you grew up with, that are part of that congregation? And
yeah, many of them have left that particular congregation, but I still interact with them a little bit on social media. A couple of them, we've had conversations about this particular issue, but I don't know. It's not a scab I want to pick at very hard.
Mm-hmm. So you landed in Anchorage in 2017.
Yep.
For the job that you have now?
That's a very similar position. So I started as a postdoc. It was supposed to be a 2-year position. But again, fell in love with Alaska and Anchorage and really liked the work I was doing. So my 2-year position became a 4-year position, which then became a kind of a year-to-year contract. And now I'm in a permanent faculty position at the university.
And what is your job?
So I work for the Institute of Social and Economic Research.
Commonly known as ISER.
Commonly known as ISER. Yeah, that's right. At UAA. My role there is as a natural resource economist. And so I study the interactions between people, communities, the state of Alaska, and our natural resources. Obviously, Alaska has a very important natural resource economic base, thinking about our oil industry, our mining industry, our fishing industry, timber, tourism, and, maybe more abstractly, our important geostrategic location, right? All of these are kind of important natural resources. And so that's most of the research that I do sort of plays on those different ideas.
Is there anything in particular that you're working on right now with regards to that? Like, I guess like you can tell us a little bit. I know that ISER has research in their name. Are you always doing research, and do you have research projects or?
Yeah, so ISER does kind of a couple of different things. One of them is on research that the state of Alaska deems important, and so provides funding to the institute to do research on specific issues.
So it's like earmarked.
Yeah, so the state will often earmark funds for particular projects that they think or that they need more information about, and so we'll kind of commission projects from ISER. Other projects are nationally funded from institutes like the National Science Foundation to think about, the impacts of climate change in Alaska. And so I'm involved in several projects related to that issue. And then ISER also has funding available for its researchers to do projects kind of on their own direction. And so we're working on some issues related to housing in Anchorage, kind of in that vein. And I think we might talk about that a little bit later. On the natural resources side, some of the research that I've done looks at the permanent fund dividend program and the socioeconomic effects that the dividend has had on the population in the state. The idea of, this large transfer of cash from the state to the people of Alaska is really interesting and kind of unprecedented in a lot of places in the world. And so it's interesting to look at some of the effects that cash has when it hits the street. And so we've looked at the effect that the PFD has on infant health and crime, labor force outcomes, maternal health, and just a number of issues related to the dividend.
I know about the infant. Well, I know about newborn and birth weight. Did y'all do the study on
birth weight and toddler weight?
Gotcha. I'll just say for our listeners, this came up in Ways and Means last year because Senator Shelley Hughes was testifying about the importance of a large dividend for rural communities, because we see in years with bigger dividends an increase in birth weight. And I was skeptical, but I found the study, and I actually apologized to Senator Hughes for my skepticism, because I guess if you could speak a little bit about that, but there actually is a correlation between birth weight and the size of the dividend.
That's right. Yeah. Like I said, so we've looked at, other researchers have looked at the correlate or the causal effect. So in economics, we usually try to get past correlation to causal relationships. And now people might take issue, with the exact strategies that we use to try to get from correlation to causation, and we could talk about some of that. But there's a causal relationship that we've identified between the effect of the dividend on toddler weight, and so found healthier infant weights and toddler weights in years that the dividend is higher. Now, that's not to say that there's not cost to the program, or that the program is good, right? ISER's research is kind of value neutral, right? We just present facts, and other people can come to conclusions about what to do on the policy side with them. But it's important to recognize that there are trade-offs from a large dividend, right? When we reallocate resources away from other spending that the state of Alaska might conduct toward the dividend program. We know that the dividend does good things, but those state dollars appropriated somewhere else might have also done good things, right? And so it's important to kind of weigh those trade-offs as we think about public policy.
I think we'll spend a few more minutes on the PFD, because it is a big topic.
Sure.
What I hear back from my first session, and I hear it from a lot of folks in Anchorage, most of whom are upper class, very comfortable with their incomes. You hear it more than once. I don't need a check from the state for $2,000. Why don't you guys just fund everything that you need to fund and stop sending us these checks? And like most folks, I think that the lens they see things through is their own lens about how this applies to them personally. And there isn't a recognition that $2,000 dividend, that hypothetical $2,000 dividend, means something different to someone whose average income is $30,000 a year, who lives somewhere where the cost of living and the price of everything is different than Anchorage.
Yeah, and actually, I would go a little bit further to say that that there are a lot of people in the state whose effective earned income is zero, that live, a traditional subsistence lifestyle, but that need some cash to interact with the cash economy, to purchase, equipment, fuel, and housing, in order to maintain that traditional lifestyle. And so the dividend is important for that reason, because it supports people who would otherwise have zero income in that lifestyle. But no, I think that you're exactly right, that the dividend means something or different to people of different socioeconomic statuses. And there are the program is very expensive. It's the largest thing that the state does in a given year, right? It's the largest appropriation that the state makes. And obviously people have different kind of philosophical opinions about, whether we should think about it as part of the larger conversation about the state budget or put it aside. And I want to acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, the legislature is going to make some choices about this, and setting the dividend totally aside from that conversation is just a little unrealistic. It is going to be money that flows through somebody's decision-making hands about what to do with it, whether the legislature decides to tie its hands with that decision or not.
Mm. The second thing I want to say about the dividend and those upper income folks who are saying they don't need the dividend is that for rich people, getting the PFD isn't the benefit. The benefit is that they're not being taxed. And I mean, I may not be saying that exactly clearly, but I guess having read lots of papers this year, that the big reason why wealthy people would want to retire in Alaska, be in Alaska, stay in Alaska, very wealthy people, is that there's no state income tax, there's no sales tax, there's this big economic benefit to them that is much, 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 much greater than that hypothetical $2,000 dividend check. And that by focusing their political will, their political spotlight on the dividend and keeping the conversation about the dividend and their entitlement to a dividend and a larger dividend, that it actually pulls time, energy, focus away from the discussion of some sort of broad-based tax in Alaska.
Yeah, I mean, I won't speak to motivations for different people,
and maybe it's not a conscious motivation.
Yeah,
but the result is that we spend all this time talking about a dividend and less time talking about the need for reliable, steady revenue for state government.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you're speaking to here is related to some work that ISER has done about the progressivity or the regressivity of different potential options to rectify our state's fiscal situation. And so when I talk about progressivity or regressivity here, I'm talking about the effects that different forms of fiscal policy would have on high-income people versus middle-income people versus low-income people. And what ISER's research has shown is that the hardest impact that you could have on lower-income individuals in the state of Alaska is reducing the amount of the PFD distribution. They are hit hardest by that. They're hit harder by that than a income tax, a property tax, a sales tax, a head tax. Name your favorite tax. Your favorite tax is going to hit middle and high income households harder than a PFD cut.
And I'm going to stop right there and emphasize that cutting the PFD is worse for poor people than a sales tax. And I bring that up because sales tax was very much a part of the conversation this last session. And I think very well-meaning wealthy folks in Anchorage believe that the simplest solution to our state's fiscal problem is to use PFD funds to fund state government. And they honestly think, well, other states don't give money to folks. But as you said, if other states don't have subsistence folks who are not living in a cash economy and, like you said, needing
cash to buy equipment.
Yeah,
I mean, we are
yeah.
a very unusual state. We have a very unusual needs. And so one more time, sales tax is less regressive and less harmful to poor people than cutting the PFD.
That's right. Yeah, or at least that is consistent with the results of ISER's previous work on this subject. Now, again, I mean, that doesn't speak to, that's not advocacy on ISER's part for a particular form of state fiscal policy. I think ISER has maintained a position that, not dealing with the state's fiscal situation is very costly. And myself and other ISER economists have argued that the state needs to address this in some way. I have personal opinions about options that I might favor. But at least, if you were only considering the distributional impacts, right, then there are lots of considerations that one might have. The efficiency of the tax, the bureaucratic costs of the tax, other considerations about fairness. But if you were only considering the distributional impacts of the tax, the worst thing that you could do for somebody that is low income in the state of Alaska is a cut to the dividend, right? So all other options are better for low income individuals than a PFD cut. Right. But again, like I said, I'm not advocating for or against any particular option. Just I think that's an important fact for people to internalize.
And I think I need to say, because this has come up in conversations with legislators who are largely in agreement with me, and that is having this conversation about not cutting the PFD and opting for some sort of broad-based tax. If there's no broad-based tax, we can't fund basic state services. I mean, we're kind of caught in this terrible conundrum where we recognize that something like a sales tax would be better than cutting the PFD, but if taxes are never going to really be on the table, then the only options are to either cut state services, cut funding for education, cut funding of the ferry system, cut, snow plowing budgets. Like everything gets on the table to be cut so that we can maintain some sort of large dividend. It's like me being the devil's advocate. It's like, well, in that case, which is better, to cut funding for all of these services so that we maintain this higher PFD, or not cut these essential services?
Yeah. One of the other things that I think is important to recognize here too is the issue of timing, which is that there's only two levers that the state can, or maybe three levers that the state can pull quickly, but really only two, when it finds itself in dire need of cash today, which, periodically, this is the situation that comes up, right? We've got a deficit. We need to fill that deficit. Where do we go for money? There are PFD cuts and oil taxes, right? Even if you do favor kind of a broad-based solution, it's going to take several years to implement it. And so, kicking the can down the road, so to speak, really is implying that you're going to have to make one of those two decisions or some combination of them at some point in the future when you've got this short-term need for cash, right? Not dealing with it today is a PFD cut at some point in the future to be able to bridge that fiscal gap.
The fastest way to generate new revenue, so we've been told, is a change to the oil tax system, because there's an oil tax infrastructure in place. So we can make tweaks there and get additional revenue faster. Are you able to talk about the way Alaska makes money off the oil industry compared to other states, and whether it's what we hear from lobbyists, for example, is that because the cost of getting oil out of the ground in the Arctic is higher than Texas, for example, that in order for it to be profitable, we need to keep our taxes lower than Texas, for example. I guess, and then the argument on the other side is that that's not true. And if we know that there's record profits being made by the oil industry, even in a market downturn, and that we could be getting more tax money from the oil industry.
So really the key question, the key question here is, will, increases in taxes on the oil industry bring more or less revenue to the state government in the short, medium, and long term, right? And I think that the evidence suggests that in the short run, the answer is clear. Higher taxes on the oil industry will bring more revenue in the short run. In the long run, I think, and in the medium and the long run, the answer is less clear. Higher taxes today, I think it's been shown consistently, do provide a disincentive for investment for the industry. So there's been good economics research that's been done on that, some of it which has been done by former advisors of mine at Colorado School of Mines, that taxes are a deterrent to investment. The question is that deterrent larger than the additional revenue that the state receives from the higher tax rates, right? And so ultimately, there's just a great deal of uncertainty here. There's a great deal of uncertainty about exactly how responsive the industry would be in terms of its investment to higher taxes. A lot of the research that's been conducted on this issue was done in the lower 48. And so there's specific circumstances up here which may make them more or less sensitive to higher taxes. But I think, honestly, the greater uncertainty we have is about the ultimate future of the fossil fuel industry. We have seen, I think, just a catastrophic collapse in the lower 48's coal industry in a very short period of time. Coal went from producing 40 or 50% of this nation's electricity to 20, 25%. I mean, over the span of a decade. And if we see a similar turnover, thinking about the rates of proliferation of electric vehicles globally, the investment that China's making. I mean, China's the whole ballgame, really, in sort of the future of the fossil fuel industry. And add India to that. And, that's really all the future demand growth right there. How long do we expect oil to be produced from the state of Alaska, right? And in significant quantities. I think it's always going to be the case that oil will be produced somewhere. The question is how much of it will be produced here. And I think that the answer is just we don't know. And that question really is determinative about this question about kind of these issues around oil taxes and their deterrent effect on investment. We don't, as a state, we don't want to kill the golden goose, right? But we also need money. And so that balancing act is very tricky.
Let's pivot.
Okay.
You talked about housing, and you have been doing research on housing. It seems a little bit outside your wheelhouse. I mean, I guess, can you just talk about how you ended up doing work with housing and how you get assigned to a project like that?
Yeah, so I think that my interest, like a lot of people's, has just been in participation in the market directly. So my husband and I bought our first house in 2021. Like I think a lot of other people did. And so we were players in a crazy market that I think has only gotten crazier. So I recognized then, and have continued to increase my recognition of, the significant challenges that exist right now in trying to purchase, your first, or, just a home anywhere in the country, but here in Anchorage too. So I was interested in the market as we started to participate in it. I've continued to keep an eye on it. And housing in Anchorage is expensive, not the most expensive in the country, but, expensive relative to other places and getting more expensive. We continue to see housing prices go up here. Inventory's down at record lows right now. Very few houses are available for purchase. And we know that, these issues have all sorts of socioeconomic effects, right? Anchorage has experienced outmigration for a number of years. And you anecdotally, and I think in the data, you see a correlation between outmigration and housing prices. People are leaving high housing cost areas and moving to higher cost housing areas.
Where are some typical low cost housing areas that somebody from Alaska might move to?
I think that you see a large exodus back to Texas. So, there was kind of a flow, right? As the state experienced our oil boom, going from 2000 to 2008, 2009, I think that there was a lot of migration from Texas to Alaska to participate in that. And then as oil prices remained high through 2014 or so, I think Texas continued to send folks up. Now I think some of those folks have moved back. And, housing has been fairly cheap in Texas for a long time, getting more expensive there like it is in a lot of other places. But Texas has seen a huge construction boom, like a lot of the South has, which has kept prices, I think, a lot more reasonable, even though it's seen, a lot of migration toward the Sun Belt in the country.
I asked because I think since we all change planes in Seattle and the West Coast is kind of the closest to Alaska, housing prices on the West Coast are not more affordable than Alaska. So that's why I wanted to ask that question, is that I think some folks are like, oh, the cost of housing is too high here. Let's find somewhere else. And you start looking and you're like, oh, maybe the cost here isn't so bad.
Yeah. And that's a great perspective to keep in mind, which is that, among, West Coast cities, we're among the most affordable large metro area, or even medium-sized metro areas anywhere along the West Coast. The housing challenges that LA, San Francisco, and Seattle have are just an order of magnitude larger than ours, which is a good perspective to have, right? Mm-hmm. It's good to know that our challenges are not as dire as a place like that. But I think that it's important to keep our eye on the ball here. We want our community to be affordable for people that want to make a life here. A lot of people move from Anchorage into the Valley in order to find lower prices there. But the prices in the Valley have crept up quite a bit over the last few years. And, although you get a larger house in the Valley, the prices aren't that much different now in median terms than they are in Anchorage or Eagle River. So again, yeah, important to keep that in perspective.
Do you see a connection between the increased cost of housing and the increased visible homelessness that we have in Anchorage?
I mean, it's certainly something. I don't think that you're wrong to think that there might be a connection there. It's not something that we have studied empirically. But certainly, if you look at cities around the country, you notice that correlation, right? That cities that have highest cost of housing tend to have high rates of homelessness. But that's just because, unhoused populations are more attracted to cities with very high incomes. And so, the causation might go the other direction, or the causation might also go the other direction too. But no, I think that the two issues are certainly related. Affordability of homes kind of up and down the price spectrum makes a difference for people. My husband and I, one of the things we do in the winter is volunteer at one of the cold weather shelters. And so we get to hear stories of a lot of families who aren't the visible part of our city's homeless population. They're the invisible part. And stories which I think are pretty sad, right? Because they are just right on the edge, just at all times between, having a place or a roof over their heads and not. And you hear stories about, an unexpected medical bill or, a car repair or something that comes up that makes them miss rent 1 month, and then the same type of emergency comes up the next month, and you've missed rent two months in a row, and suddenly you're looking for another place to stay. And when you don't have affordable options around town for a family, particularly, right? These are all folks with kids that stay at the shelter that Tyler and I volunteer at. Your options of where to go are really limited.
Rent is an interesting issue. I think when we talk about housing, folks tend to talk about home purchase and how much the price of homes has gone up. And it has gone up astronomically in the past 3 or 4 years. But rent has also gone up. And I use this as an example a lot. When I was door knocking in my district, a lot of apartment complexes in my district, I would meet folks in their 80s renting 1-bedroom apartments who talked about a 30% increase in their rent over the past couple of years, and their incomes did not go up. And so all of a sudden, a significant larger percentage of the Social Security check that they were getting was going to their rent and not to their groceries, not to other needs. And I think sometimes that's lost in the conversation about housing and the price of housing. I guess, what can we do to make the problem better?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of people don't like to think of housing as an economic market like we think about for potatoes or whatever. But it is. At the end of the day, housing is a market like others. And when you observe high prices in a market or rising prices in a market, it's either because demand is high or supply is low, right? And so we have two levers. If we want to make the price of housing go down, we either can reduce or change the nature of demand, or we can increase the supply. Those are the two levers that we have. I think that the levers that reduce demand are unattractive, right? They involve making our city less livable so that people don't want to live here. Mm-hmm. That would make demand go down, right? We don't want to do that. We want to increase the livability of our city. We want lots more people to move to Anchorage. We want this to be a dynamic place that people want to stay and raise their families. And so if anything, I think that we want to put increased pressure on demand.
Right. Well, I'm just going to interrupt and say out-migration, it seems, should have decreased demand, but we didn't see that.
That's right. Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. So there is another force that is acting at the same time and potentially even more powerfully than out-migration, which is the state's demographic change. So if we look at the types of people that were moving out, they tended to be families. These are people, married couples with a couple of kids. And while they were leaving, a different portion of our state's population was actually growing. And that was our senior population. And so we had a out-migration of households of 4 people, while we had an increase of smaller households, seniors that live, at most as a couple. But, increasingly as they get older.
So less people occupying the same size house.
Exactly, yeah. So if you think about it, 2 senior couples are 4 people, but a family of 4
is 4 people.
The family of 4 takes 1 house. The 2 seniors the 2 senior couples take 2 houses at least, right?
And did that increase in seniors, was that because they aged into it or because we actually had seniors moving here?
It's a combination of both. We actually had a net positive, some of our population was aging up. More seniors were moving in, less seniors were leaving.
Do you have an idea of why seniors would move here? Because it doesn't seem like the typical retirement destination.
No, that's right. We talked about some of the potential tax advantages that population has here versus other places, and that's certainly something that people are making some of their migration decisions on.
Snowbirders. I mean, you don't have to spend the winter here to have your residence in Alaska.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so back to solutions. So we want to increase the supply. How do we increase the supply?
We got to build more, right? That's it sounds trite, but that's basically the whole ball game right there. Like I said, it seems so untenable to want to decrease the demand for housing here. So really the only option left is to increase supply. And immediately, I think that advocates for increasing housing supply are met with a kind of a couple of standard of arguments back. We're out of buildable land. The cost of adding new supply is just too high because of utilities. But to me, these
cost of labor is too high. We don't have any laborers.
Yes.
You hear that a lot.
Building materials, shipping costs, all these things. Regulatory constraints. And so maybe we could talk about a couple of these in turn. So I'm not particularly satisfied with the explanation that it's building materials. They represent a smaller share in construction costs than labor does. And we observe radically different prices in a lot of different places. And so your construction costs in different places. And to me, that's suggestive that most of what's going on here is differences in the regulatory environment. So this is zoning and building codes, which play, I think that there are really positive aspects of those features of our municipal government. We want houses that are going to withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters, which we experience a lot here in Alaska. So we don't want to build a bunch of shoddy stuff. But at the same time, you don't want people to have to jump through a lot of unnecessary hoops in order to address this, I think, what we all recognize is a really important challenge for our community.
Do you support the efforts by the Assembly to simplify zoning code for Anchorage? Change the zoning code?
So I think that the goal is certainly in the right place.
I should say by a couple of members of the Assembly, which would be specifically Kevin Cross of Eagle River and Meg Zolotel of Midtown.
Yeah, so they have a specific proposal to consolidate the number of zones in our community down to 2. So that would simplify things.
It's whether you're on city sewer or on septic.
That's right. Yeah. So I will say that, there's an economics literature that exists out here that shows the relationship between kind of rigorous building codes and zoning regulations and housing costs. So we know that there's a relationship that if you have restrictive zoning, you have expensive housing. There's a causal relationship between those two things. That zoning increases house prices.
And that's a fact that's shown across the country, around the world.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
That's so we can take that as a given here. Now, some of that, like I said, is sort of well founded. We want some of these regulations are in place to prevent kind of negative aspects of building that we don't want. But, as I said, we don't just want to create a bunch of red tape that people have to cut through in order to do construction just for its own sake. So, like I said, I support, generally the idea that if we have a code that is more reflective of, our community's values, including this value to have more affordable housing, I think that's well placed. I don't have opinions about kind of specific proposals, but I'm kind of interested to see how these things develop on the Assembly side as they work to address some of the stuff.
Anything else we could do to increase the supply of housing?
So one of the things that I think is worth taking a look at is how we tax property in the city. I was looking at my own assessment for the house that my husband and I bought in 2021, and if you look at your assessor's report, there are 2 different values that the assessor appraises you on. There is the value of the land that your house sits on, and then there's the value of all the buildings that are built on the house.
On the land.
I'm sorry, that's right, on the land. And so I was looking at my particular home. And the value of our building appreciated something on the order of 30 or 40% over the last few years, which is consistent kind of with the movement we've seen in the general. I mean, consistent with the price increase for the home that we saw from the last transaction to when we bought it. That's what's going on around the city. The value of our land decreased by 10%, which is insane to me. In terms of what happened to our structures, they just got 5 or 6 years older.
Mm-hmm. So how could they increase? Empirically, they should be worth less.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, we try to do a good job keeping our house up, try to make repairs and stuff, but it's 3 or 4 years older than it was 3 or 4 years ago. It should be less valuable, right? The wood is getting older. At the same time, the land getting less valuable. Well, the land hasn't changed at all. It's still in exactly the same place as it was. And what these 2 values are reflective of, or what the building values are reflective of, are the general supply constraints, the general demand and supply situation
for a house like that
across the city. While the land's value is reflective of, what land is purchased at somewhere else. But, people aren't people don't want a 1982 split level East Anchorage house. As much as I love my 1982 split level East Anchorage box, people aren't looking for that shitty old thing. They just want a place to live, And land is what provides people a place to have a domicile, whether there's a built structure or not, right? And so to me, the way that we do these assessments is a little crazy, right? That the assessed value of my land could actually decrease at a time when there's less supply and more demand clearly in the city, while the value of the built property is actually increased at a time when it really should have depreciated.
Yeah, that's really weird. That's really an interesting phenomenon. Is there a way to fix that, or does it need to be fixed?
I think so. I mean, the city could, and this is, I think, the way that a lot of municipalities do property tax assessment. And so, I mean, we're not abnormal in this kind of bifurcation and placing more emphasis on the value of the built structures as opposed to the value of the land itself. But I just think, I think about the value, the relative values or the incentives that this creates. So if you have an empty lot that is not appreciating in value.
It's actually depreciating because it went down.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you have an empty lot that's actually decreasing, the property taxes on my lot actually went down at a time when the value of that land is clearly going up in town. What incentives does that create? It creates an incentive for you to wait to develop, right? And so if I have, for example, a parking lot in downtown Anchorage, incredibly valuable land, right? But that is over time actually declining in value. And I don't know if this is true for any of the specific lots in downtown Anchorage. We've created an incentive structure for people to speculate on land values by just sitting on them, or speculating on property by just sitting on them and leaving them undeveloped. When clearly something that we want to do as a city is create an incentive for developers to develop land.
Right. Well, my understanding is that a piece of land, a home, a building is worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it. And so there's sort of this almost meaninglessness of these official assessments, because regardless of what something's assessed as, if somebody with common sense recognizes that a parking lot in downtown Anchorage is worth a lot of money, they'll be willing to pay a lot of money for it, regardless of the assessment. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that the landowner is forced to sell at that price, right?
Right.
If it's relatively cheap for them to hold that property because either it's paid off or the mortgage, they got a great mortgage interest rate. Over the, as many people did over the last couple of years, or refinanced at a low cost, the value that it is appreciating at and the taxes that they have to pay actually declining potentially.
So there's less taxes this year. So why sell now? It's so cheap to just hang on to this and see what happens next year.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Just let the roulette wheel keep spinning. So the incentives that we've kind of baked into our property tax system are a little goofy. The other issue that this creates too is one of equity. You talked about the value of something being what somebody is willing to pay for it. It's not terribly difficult to look at the difference between assessed values and transacted values for different properties in the city, and seeing that there's much more of a discrepancy on one end of the spectrum than at the other. And so if we think about the property tax burden that this creates and who that falls on, I think that's another potential problem with our existing system.
Just to flesh that out a little bit. So someone could pay a lot of money for a house in a desirable neighborhood, but the assessed value could be a lot lower. So they would pay a much lower property tax than they actually paid for the home.
Yeah.
Whereas someplace else in maybe a poorer part of town, those two prices might be much more in line with each other. So someone's actually paying property taxes on the full value of their home, whereas the rich person is paying property taxes on some arbitrary value of their home that's not accurate.
Yeah. So obviously the city wants to collect some information about what actual transacted values are. And so I don't know if you had the experience of getting the card from the city in the mail after you purchased
it.
Yeah. And did you return the card with the true value that you transacted your home at?
Well, no. And I mean, I'm going to make a confession that I purchased my home right before I deployed with the Army. So I had a lot of issues going on So I don't remember. Was I supposed to do that? Is that what you're supposed to do, is write down how much you paid for it and send it back?
Yes.
That's so interesting.
Yes. So what incentives do you think that creates for people?
Yeah, don't report that. If they assess your value at like $50,000 less than you paid, then just let it be.
Right. So the incentives are totally asymmetric here, right? Because if they assess for a higher value than what you actually paid,
then you're going to correct it.
Then you correct it, right? Mm-hmm. But if they assess for a lower value than what you actually paid, why would you have any incentive to report the correct value? And so we've baked in this asymmetry right into the system, right? And I think that that's one of the things that contributes to the inequity, because these values have way more potential to be way larger discrepancies at the higher end, right? Than at the lower end of the distribution.
Well, and there's been some discussion about making the price that people paid public, having some transparency about how much homes are sold for. I know that certain folks are adamantly opposed to that, but it seems like there'd be real value in transparency and the price that people paid for homes.
I mean, at least with respect to this particular issue, yeah.
Another issue I want to bring up, and I talked about this briefly with you before we started, I attended a Zoom that was put on by Oxford economists. They disclosed that all of their data that they had gathered and their findings had been funded by VRBO.
This is one of the short-term rental
places. There's Airbnb, there's also VRBO. This particular presentation was funded by VRBO. And I had gotten the invite, and I'm sure it's because I have a short-term rental bill to create a registry for the state and also to limit the number that an individual could own. And I attended out of curiosity. Their overarching message was that the reason why home prices across the country had gone up is because incomes had gone up and that unemployment had gone down, and that these were the driving factors in the higher prices of homes, and that short-term rentals had not played a meaningful role. What's interesting is that in their own presentation, they had a picture of the country where they color-coded each state about how much incomes had gone up over a particular period. And in Alaska, they've actually gone down. So, and it was like by 0.1%. It was a very small decrease in income. And I can't remember the exact years that they were showing, but fairly recently. So to me, if the incomes had gone down, even by a very small amount in Alaska, that wouldn't explain why our home prices had gone up so astronomically. And I asked that in the chat, and they chose not to answer that question. But I guess throwing it over to you, can you talk a little bit about their finding that the real driver of the increase in cost of homes is the increase in income and the decrease in unemployment?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that it's useful to think about this question over a couple of different time periods. These short-term rental platforms have been in existence since, the late 2000s or so, early 2010s. And so obviously they can't be the explanation for rising home prices before they came into existence. And so, it really, this is a question about their degree of contribution sense. And so, I think that it's undeniable that higher incomes, but particularly lower interest rates that we've seen since the Great Recession, and in response to the pandemic, especially, that these low interest rates have also put upward pressure on housing prices.
Because people wanted to buy a home because it was a great interest rate.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it made it very affordable. I mean, if you do the calculation at how much home you can afford when the interest rate is 2% versus today's interest rates of 7 or 8%, I mean, you can afford much more home at a couple of percentage points, right? Versus when they're in the high single digits. And, anecdotally, you hear these stories from your friends, right, about how much, they were willing to bid up in these fairly competitive markets that we saw over the last couple of years that, in terms of the impact on their monthly payments, another $10, $20, $30,000 on the sales price made relatively little difference at those low interest rates. And so it was really easy to tack those kind of numbers on and bid up these prices. And so I think interest rates are probably one of the key driving factors here. Now, the question of whether or not short-term rentals have contributed to housing prices is another one that I think that economists have addressed in some of the research that we've done. There are about half a dozen papers that have looked at the impact of short-term rental markets on housing prices in different communities around the country, around the world. And surprisingly, and this doesn't happen very often in economics, the results are really consistent. That the introduction of these short-term rental platforms have increased housing prices in the places that they've gone into business in by 4 or 5 percentage points. 4 or 5%, which is large. That's a large increase. Now, is it as large as the increase that has been driven by interest rates? Probably not. But that's a meaningful change in prices over a fairly short period of time. And
that's house prices. It's not rentals. And I think that
no, actually it is rentals. So they find the papers that have looked at rentals have found almost the same increase in rental prices that are attributable to Airbnb and VRBO, about a 4-5% increase in rental prices. And we know that, it's the effect of Airbnb is particularly intense in very touristy areas. Mm-hmm. So papers that have looked at, hotspots for kind of these places, housing prices go up more, in downtown areas, for example, right. Places where people want to congregate.
Do you feel that there's room for regulation in short-term rentals?
Yeah, I do. So I would, and I say that for this reason. On the one hand, these short-term rental platforms are potentially creating an efficiency in the market. And I think that that's something that we want to keep our eyes on, which is that, I think about my neighbors down the street. They have some empty room in their basement and they rent out their basement in the summer, and that provides them some extra income. And that's great because otherwise that basement space would go totally unutilized. Mm-hmm. And so, that's great for our tourist economy here in Anchorage, right? Having more options for our visitors when they come to stay. It's great for my neighbors. They're able to deploy this space more effectively. People go out of town, for maybe a month at a time, or people snowbird. And it's
have
nice.
Space be used.
Yeah, it's nice to have that space be used versus unused. So there's definitely efficiencies that these platforms create. It is very easy to list your place on one of these websites, and the websites provide you a lot of protection on their end of things. And so it's really reduced the friction associated with doing relatively, short-term rentals, right? So I think that all of that is great. And it's something that I think regulation should keep in mind as we think about going down that road, which is how do we preserve these positive aspects of the platforms, which I think have provided a real benefit for us, while discouraging, what is basically technology-assisted regulatory arbitrage. So, we have lots of regulations on our hotel industry. For a while, Anchorage didn't tax short-term rentals like we did hotel bed stays. We have reconciled that since. But we have a lot of regulation on our hotel industry. And so it makes sense to me that if somebody is basically operating a hotel, that they should have to play by the rules that we place on our hotels. Mm-hmm. And so making our rules a little bit more consistent across these two sectors makes sense to me. And again, kind of keeping an eye on the difference between somebody renting out a spare room in their house for a couple of weeks in the summer versus somebody who has a professionalized operation.
And owns 5 homes. They're all short-term rentals. There is a difference. We're getting towards the end of our time, but Dallas, back to Texas, Dallas City Council outlawed short-term rentals outright in residential neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. It was a very NIMBY thing to do in a way, because they were basically saying that these short-term rentals are causing a lot of noise and issues with parking on our street. And so it was basically people saying like, hey, we don't want the house next door to us to have a bunch of strangers going in and out of. But what was interesting, and it's come up and it's been sort of a surprise for some people, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most cities have a different property tax rate for commercial real estate versus residential real estate. Anchorage does not. As my understanding is that we have the same rate. And I know that we don't want to disincentivize new businesses or that, but I think that sort of I'm probably going to cut this out because I don't really have a good point to make here, but that people had said like, oh, well, why don't you, if they're going to use their property as commercial real estate, then they should be taxed like commercial real estate. And of course, my response was, that really won't do anything in Anchorage because we treat them the same.
So, one of the areas that I would think that it would be important to explore here is where we do have differential tax treatment potentially with these properties, which is with respect to our residential property tax exemption. So Anchorage has, one of the largest property tax exemptions that you can get is if you live on site, right? Mm-hmm. Live on your property. And so, for the situation that I was describing with my down the street neighbors, they live on site, right? So they claim a residential property tax exemption, they rent out their spare room, no problem. But for situations where somebody has kind of a more professionalized operation where they might own several homes, clearly they're only going to reside in one of them. And I think it's an interesting question about whether or not somebody might be claiming residency on any of the other properties. And so making sure that the city's enforcement of the residential exemption is robust, I think would be another important incentive, right, for people to play by the rules here.
Right. Enforcement is something that's come up. It comes up a lot, actually. And whether we want to invest more in enforcement, in folks who are hired simply to do the research and check and make sure that everybody who's claiming a residence actually does reside there, because it's not something that you can Google, really. It's hard to know.
Yeah. So let's say that hypothetically there were some type of registry of Airbnb listings that the property tax assessors could check against to see, and then potentially Airbnb remits data from that registry on this entire home was rented out, 300 days, last year on our platform,
There's no way
that's unlikely to be,
hypothetically, that person could be getting a PFD registered at that address.
That's right, yeah.
And so, I think that there could be potential for the state and the municipality to...
Yeah, and I think that people obviously just respond to the incentives that policy creates for them here, right? I don't want to say anybody's a bad person for doing these things. Policy has created incentives for people to act in a particular way. And if we want them to act differently, then we should change the policy and they'll respond accordingly, right? If we put different incentives in place, financial incentives particularly are strong for people. And if we want them to play by a different set of rules, we just have to create that different set of rules.
Hey, Brett, thank you so much for being here today. I guess Dr. Watson.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Andrew. This has been great.
Last question we ask everybody is to recommend a book. It doesn't have to be related about what we talked about. It doesn't have to be a book either. Some people recommend a movie or a TV show or something that they would like our listeners to experience.
Yeah, so can I do another podcast recommendation?
Yes.
Not to create more competition for you, but a podcast that's been really really great for me in shaping some of my thinking on some housing issues and a lot of other economic issues is the Odd Lots podcast by Bloomberg. If people are interested in kind of approachable conversations about economic and financial topics, I think that they might enjoy Odd Lots.
I need to listen to that.
Yeah, it's great.
Okay. Hey, thanks again. Thanks so much.
Andrew. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you to Maya Narang for making this podcast listenable, and thank you to you, our listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookclub@gmail.com. That's East Anchorage Book Club, all one word, at gmail.com.